thank you all for coming. I'm excited to have a chance to talk again at the Macerc Showcase on some work that we've been doing for a few years now, thinking about starry stonewort and its invasion dynamics, and in particular how those might be influenced by climate conditions and eventually changing climate. I know many of you probably know a lot about starry stonewort, so I won't belabor the sort of introduction parts of it, but starry stonewort, it's a green macroalgae. It's also known as Nidalopsis obtusa. On the screens, you'll probably see me use a bunch of different abbreviations: starry stonewort, SSW, N obtusa. They all mean the same thing. And it's a charophyte. It's closely related to the stoneworts and muskgrasses. And as you can see in these lower pictures, it could pretty easily be misidentified or mistaken for Charas or Nitella species. So this is a few years old, but this is kind of the general distribution of starry stonewort in the United States. It started in sort of New York, St. Louis Seaway, and has been moving its way westward. Minnesota is still the westernmost extent of that distribution. And this is a map that I sort of have continued to update, and I think I have to stop updating it because there's too many dots. And I think it's already out of date as of like 3 days ago. I believe there was another lake up in the northern part of the state that's been identified. But as you can see, there's kind of these two clusters that I think is kind of interesting of starry stonewort in kind of near around the Bemidji area, and then sort of a more southern central Minnesota cluster, sort of around starting from Lake Coronis, which is where the initial, if not the initial infestation, at least the initial identification of starry stonewort in Minnesota. When we think about starry stonewort and we think about its potential impacts on lakes and lake ecosystems and lake communities, I tend to think about two particular things. And they're both really driven by the fact that starry stonewort just grows into these super dense, super large aggregations that become largely monospecific. And when you have that much starry stonewort, it can impede recreation. It makes it hard to boat through. You probably don't want to go swimming in it. Makes the fishing a lot less fun or of high quality because there aren't generally a whole lot of fish in amongst the starry stonewort. And then the other thing that I think about a lot is the impacts on native communities. And the idea is it grows, and it grows so dense that it sort of displaces and chokes out a lot of other species, native species in particular. So you have a loss of diversity and a loss of uniqueness, which then the idea is that actually will make these systems less resilient, and they'll have reduced sort of services, particularly some of those recreational services like fishing. We've been interested in this for a while, and we started off with a pilot study of sort of the invasion dynamics in Lake Coronis in about 2017, I would say. And the idea there was we wanted to actually establish transects, like specific areas that we could watch the spread of starry stonewort, see how quickly it moved, and we would know something about the native community that it was spreading into and what it was doing to that native community. So we established a set of these 30-meter transects, or generally 30-meter transects, and the idea was the transect would start in a patch of high density and like nearly 100% starry stonewort cover, but then spread in or move into an area that was fully native dominated, and there would be, the idea was sort of a sharp transition from starry stonewort to native species. And then the idea is we would swim along, generally on scuba, along that transect, and every meter we could say, what percentage of cover was starry stonewort or other species, and what other species. And so in 2017, we first established our pilot study in Lake Coronis. And so it looked kind of like this. You can see the redder colors are high starry stonewort abundance, and the dark blues are no starry stonewort. And functionally, that means that it's 100% native plant species. And you can see we had that idea that in the beginning of those transects were all starry stonewort dominated. The ends were generally entirely native dominated. And the idea, and I think what we mostly were able to get was these pretty sharp transitions where there was a clearly delineated end to the starry stonewort. That wasn't entirely perfect, but that was sort of the idea. And then we went back in 2019, we're able to resurvey each of those transects, and it was a pretty dramatic shift. We kind of thought that maybe it would take 5 years, 10 years sort of to see that spread happen. But within the course of those 2 years, 4 out of the 5 transects that we'd established basically became entirely dominated by starry stonewort. It was super dramatic. I think what I heard is there was an audible gasp in the room when this data was presented at the Macerc showcase by Carly Wagner a few years ago. And so we were like, really surprised about that. And, it seemed like starry stonewort was following this general trend of what we think about invasions, where, they're initially absent, then they establish, but they're pretty rare, and they sort of expand pretty slowly, but then they hit this inflection point and just start, growing gangbusters, and it just sort of takes over quickly once it starts growing. And most importantly, it's a one-way ticket. It's just always getting more extensive, more abundant, and it's just an always growing sort of pattern. And we were worried that's what was happening. But at the same time, I had spent a fair amount of time on Lake Coronis, and I'd seen parts of Coronis that, looked like this. There was really abundant, really extensive starry stonewort patches. But then I would come back in another year, and that same spot would still have starry stonewort, but it just wouldn't be quite as abundant and not quite as problematic. So, I was really interested in, is this really the path? Is it just a one-way, ever increasing abundance? Or, is it, was that a fluke, or are there scenarios where the biomass of starry stonewort can actually go down? And then for me, what I was really wondering is, is it the climate or weather that can influence what happens from one year to the next? And so I was interested in sort of testing that, sort of looking a little bit more deeply and a little bit more broadly to see how consistent this pattern was, or was that scenario in Lake Coronis kind of a one-off, and or is that what we should expect generally? So we established this larger project. We had a handful of hypotheses. One, we actually assumed that increasing with climate change, warmer conditions would actually increase the biomass and speed the spread of starry stonewort. We thought that, this increase of starry stonewort would displace native species, and we'd get these more and more starry stonewort dominated and basically monospecific patches. And that specifically we would, or a specific way that we think that competition might happen is because the climate conditions could influence the phenology, sort of the seasonal timing of starry stonewort over the course of the year. So to get at those hypotheses, we decided to do a handful of things really sort of similar to that pilot study, just at a much larger scale. And so we established 9 experimental lakes, starting from the southernmost in Indiana into Wisconsin, and then up into Minnesota with both Lake Coronis in that lower cluster, and then a couple lakes, Lake Moose Lake and Lake Winnipesaukee in the upper cluster. We set up those same transects, either 4 or 5 of these sort of 30-meter transects in each of those lakes. And then the idea was to measure plant cover and starry stonewort expansion on at least an annual basis, if not more. And then at the same time, we would do not just sort of measuring the cover on those transects, but actually pull up biomass and measure both, at peak biomass, how much there was in each of these lakes, but then also to watch over the course of, through the entire growing season, sort of April or May until October, to sort of get at that phenology and that sort of seasonal dynamic of when does it start growing, when does it peak, and then how quickly does it sort of die back. So first thing we did is we went back, so the first data I'll show you, it's not necessarily the first thing we did, but so we have that data from Coronis, that initial sort of pilot study. We went back and measured again. We actually measured with a little bit more fine spatial resolution. So there's the data is even a little bit more, that's why the squares look a little different. And what you could see is actually kind of surprising. It didn't just stay completely starry stonewort dominated. There are actually a handful of different places where the abundance dropped either a little bit, like in that T2 transect 2, or actually you had pretty like large losses or reductions in starry stonewort, like in T1 and parts of T4. So that was very interesting to us, that it doesn't have to be this constant increasing pattern. So then if we look across all of the different lakes that we had across Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and this doesn't actually include Coronis for some technical reasons it's not worth getting into. So you can see, again, we have that idea. We set up all of these transects, and the key to look at here, it's like that idea that it starts out in starry stonewort dominated, and then it spreads into native dominated. They're not always super sharp transitions, but doing a pretty good job, I thought. And then you can see in 2020 and 2022, the abundances are different. And it's pretty hard to just look directly at these graphs. So what I've done is essentially calculate the changes from 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021. And when it's green, it's essentially the abundance of starry stonewort is kind of the same. The red colors are where starry stonewort is increasing, and the blue colors are where starry stonewort is actually decreasing. And interestingly, there's a lot of places where you have changes, and even more, or I don't know, to me, surprising and interesting is that there's many places where we actually saw reductions in starry stonewort from one year to the next. And in some places, like on Crooked Lake, actually within the same transects, there would be parts that were gaining and parts that were losing. And that's kind of I think, an interesting pattern. And we'll get a little bit into more details of that in a second. But, the key thing to think about is, so we have this idea of, does this invasion just constantly increase? Or, and I think it's pretty clear that the answer to that is no, that there is actually far more variability and heterogeneity. You've got periods where it's going up and where it's going down. But so it begs the question, so what is going on? One, let's actually confirm, is there displacement? Is starry stonewort leading to reductions in native plants? Like all that data I've shown you so far is just about how much starry stonewort there was. But then the second question of, is this really driven by climate? Like by climate conditions, is there a climate effect? So the first thing we can look at is this question of displacement. So here so each of those dots is like an individual square meter on one of those transects. And I've looked at I've pulled down to just the transect or just the plots that had increases in Nidalopsis obtusa or starry stonewort cover. So this is places where there's more starry stonewort in one year than in the previous. And you can see, while there is a lot of variability and a bit of noise, there's also a pretty strong pattern that when there's more starry stonewort, it basically is perfectly trading off with a reduction in native species. When there's 50% more starry stonewort, there's also generally 50% less native. So it is very much a story of displacement of native species by starry stonewort. But that's not the whole story. That first panel is just looking at the areas where there was increasing starry stonewort cover, but the data set's actually much broader. And there's, in fact, as I was just saying, a lot of places where we're actually losing starry stonewort. And so if we focus on this upper left quadrant, which is where you're actually getting reductions in starry stonewort, you can see that there's also concurrent increases in native species. So it's, while there is displacement, it's actually kind of interesting and useful to know that if starry stonewort starts to reduce or die off, these native species are actually recovering and sort of refilling in that space, which is really interesting and actually very sort of positive. It gives you it makes you think that if you took a lot of effort to actively remove starry stonewort, these native plants can actually come in. And in particular, one of the sites that I think we had a lot of reduction, it probably is because of a bunch of management effort that was happening in that lake. And so I think that's actually really positive news. And so also the question that I think still sits is, is this difference of when you're getting losses and when you're getting increases, is that driven by climate? So we took this same data set, and now instead of just plotting changes of natives versus starry stonewort, we looked at how starry stonewort and native species cover changes as a function of average temperatures. And you can see that we do have significant effects of climate or significant correlations with climate, but you actually have this interesting opposing effect on starry stonewort and natives. Starry stonewort, and this is exactly counter to what we had hypothesized, we actually are getting a reduction in abundance under hotter temperatures, while the native species are having an increase in coverage under hotter temperatures. And I'll also make a point to say, these relationships came out under sort of different data for the starry stonewort and the natives. Starry stonewort, that relationship was actually about the average summer temperature. So hot summers are bad for starry stonewort, but it was actually warmer winters that led to or that correlated with more abundance of the native species. So it's interesting that they're sort of responding to these conditions a little differently. And so it begs this question, like, are these sort of niche differences between starry stonewort and native species? Is starry stonewort maybe sitting at the warm edge of its niche, or is Minnesota at the warm edge of its niche? And so if it gets a little bit warmer, it just can't handle it, but these native species are. Or are these two different effects really just a story of competition? Is like either the natives are getting benefited or starry stonewort getting hurt by the warm temperatures, and then the other one is just responding to changes in competition. So the last thing, or the next thing I want to talk about was, so we did try to get at a specific mechanistic question that might be driving these patterns and this competition in particular. And so we wanted to look, as I mentioned, about the phenology, sort of the seasonal dynamics of starry stonewort and these native species. And there was a paper that Dan Larkin and my group put out about a year ago, where we looked at starry stonewort compared to other native plants and showed that starry stonewort tends to actually have this very late season phenology, that's sort of that dark green shaded line and sort of area under the line, that you can see that it sort of peaks in abundance sort of at the pretty late in the year and later than most of the native species. And so there was a reason to imagine that like these different phenologies and changes in phenologies might influence something about the expansion and interaction and competition. So we had data from a number of years, both from our own studies, and actually there was some historical data from the 1980s about the phenology of starry stonewort, basically just looking at biomass at multiple time points over the year. And what you should remember is essentially each of these lines I'm going to show you, 1984 are sort of the coolest conditions, and then 2018 and 2021 are the warmest conditions. And you can see, this was the pattern originally. It had a pretty slow sort of ramp up, and then the abundance actually sort of stayed high for quite some time, like actually through into January of the following year. In 2017, things are certainly warmer, and you can see that the peak comes a little bit earlier, but it does still stay high for quite some time. And then what's interesting in 2018 and 2019 is these peaks are both earlier, especially in 2021, but also you have these very rapid diebacks, and so it's more peaky. You get to your sort of max biomass quickly, but then they can't really hang on for very long, which again, I think is a suggestion that it might be approaching sort of the kind of climate tolerance, or this might be sort of the edge of sort of niche conditions that starry stonewort can handle. So that's a bunch of data, sort of some general conclusions. One, we really do see a lot of variability in biomass between years and lakes. And the starry stonewort expansion is not constant every year. It actually goes up and down, which suggests there might be some significant potential for resilience in these systems, that they can come back from starry stonewort sort of takeovers a little bit. The phenology shows earlier peaks and faster declines in warm years. But the sort of unexpected, the starry stonewort abundance is lower in warm years. And this potentially is producing an opportunity for natives to recover. It still leaves open this question of the role of climate in competition with native species, in particular specific native species. And so we're still trying to get at those questions. I want to take just a few minutes. I know we're getting close, but I wanted to talk about, this is a really interesting project because we were doing all of this ecology of starry stonewort, but because we're really interested in management and how people make management decisions, there's actually a whole second component to this project, which is thinking about the social aspects of management and management decisions. And so we had, particularly some collaborators who ran this, they did a bunch of interviews with stakeholders across Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, aligned with those monitoring lakes, to sort of get at their understanding about starry stonewort and their preferences. We had a lot of different types of people: lake association members, DNR people, scientists, recreational users, management professionals. Probably all the people who are watching this, like, you guys are the types of folks that we were interviewing. And we had these semi-structured interviews. where there were open-ended questions about your experience with lakes and with Starry stonewort, management actions, preferences, goals, and really what are your outcomes that you want from management or just Starry stonewort and usage of lakes. We took those interviews, we transcribed them, and then we coded and analyzed them to identify different themes. These are the kinds of things that we were looking at. You've got these sort of major codes like goals for management, perceived causes, obstacles, and then different subcodes and that were often sort of specific issues like ecological health, prevention, natural causes, recreational, social. You don't have to read all the details here, but the idea was we looked for all these different topics and then tried to sort of tease out, are there any general patterns that are coming out of people's preferences? And what we found is actually that there were two broad, what we're referring to as lake ethics, sort of general constellations of opinions that tended to go together. And one was this idea of a public good lake ethic, where people tended to think of what was important is for lakes to be accessible and recreation opportunities to be unfettered. They believed that lake health matters because it facilitates human enjoyment, and that they tended to really support things like chemical treatments and nuisance management. But interestingly, they often wanted less management. They wanted to address these specific problems, but they didn't necessarily think that you had to eradicate Starry stonewort from the full lake. A typical quote from this, from a stakeholder that had this opinion, might be something like this: the current goal, because there's not effective controls, is managing this so that recreation can continue. This idea that we care about lakes because they have this particular value and utility to people, and management should be guided by facilitating that. Alternatively, we had a group of people that had this exclusive resource lake ethic, where they thought of lakes as valuable mostly when they're in sort of a more pristine, unchanged by human activity condition. For them, lake health had its own sort of intrinsic value, which in turn, did benefit people, but there was this intrinsic value that was not, as a result, purely of its sort of utility to people. And they tended to prefer things like preventative management and physical removal. And then here's a quote from them. I won't read the entirety of it. And so it was interesting to see that there were these two different lake ethics. But I will say, it's not like you're either one or the other. They tended to sit, people tended to sit on a continuum from public good to exclusive resource. And also, as I said, there's some moments where these different ethics can have contradictory ideas, like, being really in favor of chemical treatment, which we think of, or I tend to think of, as a really harsh strategy, but at the same time, oftentimes also saying, well, we don't need as much management. And so these aren't sort of perfect and consistent things. But the point of doing all of this is that, the idea that understanding these social motivations can inform or tailor management efforts, to different, so something that we found is that these different ethics tended to align with different stakeholder types. Property owners tended to align with the exclusive resource, whereas lake association governance members often were more aligned with the public good ethic. We also had spatial patterns, which was one of the most interesting things we found, which is that the public good ethic tended to be more common in the South and in Indiana, whereas as you move northward, and particularly into Minnesota, there was very much the exclusive resource ethic. And so, this could be driven by a bunch of things, like those more northern lakes tend to have less density of people. They tend to be more rural. Property values tended to be much higher in the southern lakes. And also, there's just cultural identities. Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. Like we have a very strong identity, which I could imagine like influences this idea of the intrinsic value and those ideas. So anyhow, oh, I thought there was, okay, yeah. So there are a couple conclusions here. Oh, I guess I just read all these too. There you go. So that's pretty much all I have to say, other than to say, like, I really want to thank all the collaborators. In particular, I've mentioned Abigail Sullivan and Matthew Hauser as the two social scientists that were driving that component of the project. Carolyn Kalinowski, who did pretty much everything in the field, and then Dan, who's really advised us as well. And then all the folks, in particular Macerk, who's helped fund the project, and the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute, which is also our major funder. And open if you guys have any questions. Ethan.
Yep, I can read them for you. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Ranjan, for that information today. And that's a great ending slide. Makes me want to be there right now. We have a first question here from Alicia. Did you find any locations where another invasive species took hold, such as the Eurasian water milfoil?
I mean, so many of the lakes that we work on have both starry stonewort and these other species, and other invasive species. And I think that in general, so yeah, it was often common to have them both, but I actually think that when starry stonewort became like, fully matting and just taking over everything, it would also exclude milfoil as well, and curly leaf pondweed. I think that when starry stonewort sort of takes over, it like really does take over. We also, the other interesting thing that we found was a number of lakes where there was a lot of zebra mussels, but I'm not sure if I have any thoughts about interactions between starry stonewort and zebra mussels. But we found them, and like there's a lot of lakes where they're both happening, and I don't have a sense yet of what that interaction might be.
This next question, what are the effects of temps on starry stonewort in Europe? Are they the same as here?
Sorry, was that the effects of temperatures?
The effects of temperatures, yeah, on starry stonewort in Europe, which might just be an opinion.
Yeah, I honestly have no idea. I don't know. I don't have any idea because I don't know of any studies that have looked at that. Yeah, that's that would be interesting to look into to see if it. I mean, I don't think anybody is doing this kind of work on starry stonewort, but there may have been for other reasons that somebody was looking at that. I know starry stonewort is actually often used in I want to say kind of in like molecular biology sort of applications because it has these very large cells. And so it's possible that through something like that, somebody's kind of looked at it. But I don't know of any like ecological studies that have gotten at that, but I'll try and take a look.
This next question comes from Jeff. Does starry stonewort hybridize with native Cara, possibly Chara?
Kara's, yeah. No, I think that they're probably too disparate to hybridize, and I've not seen any evidence of it. I've also not seen anybody thinking about that. I think because they're just really too distant. The other thing that's interesting is there's only been one sex of starry stonewort. I think it's only the males have been identified in North America. So there's not even like sexual reproduction going on with starry stonewort. It is really mostly just fragmentation and asexual reproduction. And what I can say is like the one study that I've seen that has really looked at the genetics does show that like there's this very limited genetic diversity because of the lack of sexual sexual reproduction. And so I think if there was more hybridization, they would have probably seen that. But again, yeah, I think that Keras are probably just too genetic, like they're too disparate. They're not closely related enough to hybridize.
Here's the other question. Have you any indication that chemical treatment can increase the production of bulbils?
Yeah, I think that this is a pretty contentious result that we had in one of our studies, that we did see, two things happened. There was a chemical treatment, and then in the measures of starry stonewort bulbul densities that we took, there was more. I'm pretty hesitant to say that that's a strong causal relationship. I think that there's a lot of other things that could influence that, or influence the data that we have about that. I think what is totally clear is that the bulbils survive and persist and are not, like, maybe some, but not all of the bulbils are like killed by the algicides. And I think that there are some potential issues with how, at least in the one study that we've done, I think we have less accurate counts of bulbils than I would really want to stake a strong claim on that relationship. But it is what we saw in one study. So that's my totally not strong answer about this.
Thank you. This next question comes from Amanda. When the starry stonewort took over from other invasive plants, did Eurasian water milfoil or curly-leaf pondweed come back in the transect when starry stonewort declined? Or were the natives able to emerge earlier to decrease all invasive plants?
Oh yeah, that's interesting, because I was doing some of these analyses to look at how individual species were sort of interacting with starry stonewort, and I can't remember. I think that Eurasian water milfoil is probably the only one. Maybe curly. I think those would be the only ones that we'd have any data on. And my instinct is that like they came back as much as like any native species did, but I don't have that data in front of me, so I wouldn't want to be quoted on that.
This next question just says, could drought also have an effect?
Yeah, so I think that's like a pretty big question. This, this 2021 data that we had, it was super warm, but it was also super dry, and water levels were really low. I think that those could very much have had, I think the drought part could have it's just as likely that had an influence as the temperature. Although my instinct on this, and it's just an instinct, I wouldn't, again, like, we don't have any data to really confirm it. I think that phenology, or at least the growth part of the phenology, is probably more driven by temperature, but I could imagine that the rapid die-off part was a bit more influenced by the drought, and as much as drought is just like low water levels, which is, I don't know, it's interesting, like, what does drought mean in a lake versus what does drought mean like in a terrestrial system? In a lake, it's still wet. It's just like, what I thought of as like, it was like the lake levels just really went down, which I think had a lot of influence. And especially like in Winnipegashish, water levels were so low that like we like couldn't even get a boat into some of the locations. We had to like just swim or honestly sometimes walk in the water because it was just like, you know, knee high. And so, but again, like, is that like that might, you know, a real influence of that might be that it like low water level plus warm air temperatures led to really warm water temperatures. And so I think both those things are probably influencing it.
All right, great. Thank you. If we have time for just a few more questions. So unless anybody has any other questions, this should be our last one. This question says, how does starry stonewort compete with highly invasive vascular plants such as milfoil?
Yeah. Again, I'm really wishing I remembered that data a little more explicitly, but my instinct is that especially at so I think that there's probably a little bit of a depth influence here. At the shallower depths, I think starry stonewort tends to really just become monospecific and just fully takes over. I know in a number of our transects, we would often find, I think the places where the milfoil hung on a little better and like sort of persisted, it tended to be in the slightly deeper depths. And, you know, my instinct there is just that the milfoil has this ability to, you know, starry stonewort can get very tall, but not as easily or as readily or as much as like milfoil. Like, you know, milfoil can totally get from like 10 to 12 feet down up to, you know, near the surface, whereas like when it's that deep, we'll have starry stonewort, but it's been rare that I've seen starry stonewort like fully filling the water column like from 10 feet up to the surface. Like when it's more like 6 feet, it totally can. I've seen it get all the way to the surface. But I think in those slightly deeper sections, invasives like milfoil are able to like still do a pretty good job and hold on and maybe dominate the space a little bit more. While my impression is in these like more shallow areas, the starry stonewort like really, that's where I would expect that it sort of really does just fully displace everything else. But and I wish I had that explicit data on sort of milfoil recovery after like a starry stonewort reduction, but I don't. Maybe next year we'll have that analyzed.
Thank you so much. And join me in thanking Dr. Muthukrishnan for all the research he presented here today.